Good afternoon and welcome to the School of Public Affairs at the American University. My name is Jose Luis Fernandez, and as a finishing graduate student of public administration at this fine institution, I feel great honor and distinction to present this historic academic forum, Puerto Rico in Search of Full Democracy. This event is being broadcasted live from Washington, D.C. through WOSO Radio San Juan for the benefit of the residents of Puerto Rico. School of Public Affairs, Dean Leo Grande, members of American universities in the Washington metropolitan area academic community, guests from other national higher education institutions, distinguished members of congressional offices, high-ranking government officials, members of national and international organizations, and special guests. Our guest speakers and panelists, I must say that it was a difficult group to put together. We received a notification from one of our speakers, Mr. Pedro Ortiz Alvarez, canceling his participation Friday afternoon due to personal matters. So we formally excused Mr. Ortiz Alvarez, and we appreciate the interest of the person who substituted him. We have dedicated a significant amount of time identifying panelists who will be asking questions following the presentations, and we excuse the presence of other invited representatives from the offices of House Minority Leader Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, Congressman Luis Gutierrez, and also Mr. Alan Stamen, who had confirmed and had an emergency as well with the business related to the U.S. Senate. This means that the number of questions from the panelists will be reduced and giving us an opportunity to have questions from the audience as well. I would like to recognize our keynote speakers, Mr. Alexander Deschelidze, author of the book Paid to the Order of Puerto Rico, The Cost of Dependence, Mr. Luis Vega Ramos, former president of Proela, presenting the case for the Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth, Mr. Manuel Rodriguez Orellana, former senator from the Puerto Rican Independence Party, presenting the case for independence, Mr. Carlos Chardon, former Secretary of Education of Puerto Rico, presenting the case for statehood. And we are still waiting for Mr. Jeffrey Farrell, former co-chair of the President's Interagency Group on Puerto Rico under the Clinton administration, and we should be expecting him throughout the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the American University School of Public Affairs, Dr. William Leo Grande.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to American University and the School of Public Affairs, those of you who are visitors to our campus. We have a very distinguished panel, as you can see, and we're very much looking forward to a spirited exchange of views today, which I'm sure we'll have. I want to say that the School of Public Affairs, of course, is one of the nation's leading centers for the study of public policy, public administration, and political science in the United States. Our role, as we see it, is not only to educate our own students, but to provide a forum for the debate of critical public issues. And this event today is a perfect example of the kind of thing that we see as central to our mission. I want to congratulate especially Jose Luis Fernandez for organizing this impressive forum. It was his idea to put this together. He did much of the work in organizing and bringing together the panelists. Naturally, we provided him a bit of assistance in my office on the logistical side, and I want to thank my staff who had a hand in that. But the conception of this event today is really his, and I see that as exemplary of the kind of initiative that we try to teach to our students, and Jose has obviously learned it very well. So without further ado, let me turn the podium back to him to get the program underway. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for your words, Dean Leo Grande, and thank you very much for your support in the development of this event as well. I also want to recognize the presence of Mr. Manasseh Mansour, who has significant experience dealing with Puerto Rican matters. And of course, he's the lonely panelist today after trying to get a few more panelists in here, but hopefully we will have a very good interaction after the presentations. We are very enthusiastic about the forum an event envisioned to transform the traditional way of addressing the long-lasting and extensively debated political status situation of Puerto Rico, a small territory in the Caribbean with over 3.8 million U.S. citizens. This extraordinary opportunity comes at a time in history when a commitment between the island's leadership and the federal government must transcend beyond previous efforts and perceptions. President George W. Bush expressed in his 2005 inaugural address that freedom by its nature must be chosen, defended by citizens, and sustained by the rule of law. He also emphasized that it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions. The administration extends this message throughout the world, then leading the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico into a fully democratic status should be a priority. Traditionally, the status discussion is argued and presented from the institutional perspective of political parties, but I must say that at this critical moment, the efforts must go beyond party lines, opening a space for all sectors of society to express their desire to attain economic and political conditions that would embrace true ideological values, achieving sovereignty and aspiring to bring stability and a sense of common purpose for the people of Puerto Rico. This forum was conceived with the objective of presenting the case for statehood, Commonwealth, and independence from an academic perspective by people who are not political appointees or hold elective positions. These professionals have extensive governmental experience and at the present time are not constrained by strategic interests associated with political campaigns or platforms, allowing them to speak their own minds. The emphasis of the presentations will primarily be on economic development, nationalism, nationality, and identity issues, and constitutional and juridical matters, all within the political framework of Puerto Rico. The forum was also intended to present the institutional position of the federal government, and we are hoping that Mr. Jeffrey Farrell joins our panel this afternoon to present that position. It was also conceived to consider the concerns about the cost of dependence to the American taxpayer from the perspective of an individual who has done extensive research about the matter concerning Puerto Rico's self-determination, leading him to write a nationally recognized book. So I must say that we will obtain a wealth of knowledge from this event. Our guests have collectively agreed on the format of this forum, and having said that, our first speaker, Alexander Odyshelidze, will have 10 minutes to make his presentation. Each presenter of a status formula as well as the institutional position of the federal government will have 15 minutes. Following the presentations, each panelist will ask a question to one of the guest speakers, and 2 minutes will be allowed for a response. Immediately following the panelist intervention, questions from the audience will be presented. Please write down your question on the index card provided as you enter the auditorium and also indicate to whom the question is addressed to. The questions will be gathered and will be presented from the podium. We appreciate your consideration and respect to the guest speakers and panelists who have kindly agreed to be here today, sharing their perspectives with all of us. We will now proceed with the presentation of our first guest. Alexander Odyshelidze is the president of financial consulting firm Employee Benefits Associates Incorporated for over 10 years. He also wrote a syndicated column for Scripps Howard, which was picked up by over 300 newspapers nationwide. Mr. Odyshelidze has been intimately involved in the self-determination, decolonization process of Puerto Rico, being the founding member of the Citizens Educational Foundation, a foundation organized by a group of local business leaders to provide information about Puerto Rico's political status. He is the author of the book, Puerto Rico at the Crossroads, and his latest book, Paid to the Order of Puerto Rico, The Cost of Dependence, co-authored by Arthur Lafer with foreword by Larry Kudlow, was released in mid-2004. Prior to his consulting writing and publishing activities, Mr. Odyshelidze was a principal and CEO of an insurance company and is currently on the board of a major publicly held U.S. insurer. Please join me in welcoming the author of the book, Paid to the Order of Puerto Rico, Mr. Alexander Odyshelidze.
Thank you.
I see some worried faces out there. No, I'm not going to read excerpts from my book, I promise. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank American University and Dean Leo LeGrand for having the guts to put this program together, because believe me, it takes guts, and especially Jose for putting such a fabulous program together. The logistics of putting something difficult, and he did it. I also want to make it clear that I'm just a warm-up act. I only wrote this book that touched a few nerves. The real experts are right here, are sitting right here. And I'm also here with some mixed emotions. Now, you know what the definition of mixed emotions is? It's pushing your mother-in-law off a cliff in your brand new Maserati. You see, in my book, I talk about these terrible pharmaceutical companies that use the concept of controlled foreign corporations in order to gain $5 billion a year in tax credits. And as a result of that, they have to keep Puerto Rico as a colony, as a territory. They've hijacked Puerto Rico's political process. And as a result of it, they're forcing U.S. taxpayers to spend $22 billion a year to support this colony. Well, it's horrible what these controlled foreign corporations are doing. Well, I've got a confession to make. I, too, own a controlled foreign corporation. And I, too, take advantage of some of those tax benefits. Not $5 billion a year's worth, but quite a bit. So if I'm successful in eliminating this evil, I'm really killing the goose that laid my own golden egg. But you see, I wrote the book because I was outraged. And let me tell you what I was outraged about. I'm outraged that I, as an American taxpayer, have to personally contribute $400 every year, as do millions of other tax-paying American families, for a total of $22 billion annually to support Puerto Rico just because the pharmaceuticals want to enjoy $5 billion a year in tax credits. I'm outraged that I, as a 35-year resident of Puerto Rico, could not vote for representatives from Puerto Rico in U.S. Congress who have voting influence there, or the President of the United States, who make decisions that affect Puerto Rico every day without having to respond to 4 million U.S. citizens' concerns who live there. I'm outraged that after having been raised under the communist system and having come to America at age 19 with $10 in my pocket, and after having taken a healthy slice of the gold that those American streets are paved with, which were built on principles of democracy and entrepreneurship, that the inhabitants of my residence of 35 years cannot enjoy this full democracy and are subject to the second-class citizenship which keeps them in a colonial quagmire. I'm outraged that America, the bastion of freedoms, democracy and free enterprise, can still, after all the colonial powers have given up their colonies, including the former Soviet Union, can still maintain a possession of 4 million disenfranchised American citizens, especially in the light of a couple of thousand American soldiers, many of them Puerto Ricans, giving up their lives to bring democracy to Iraq. Now, the detractors to these ideas are going to say, wait a minute, what territory, what colony? There's a compact between Puerto Rico and the United States. Puerto Rico is a Commonwealth. As a matter of fact, they passed the Public Law 600 in 1954 that would allow Puerto Rico to write its own constitution. Nonsense. It was firmly established by U.S. Congress that Puerto Rico is under the territorial clause. And that's where it is. It's a possession of the United States. One of the gentlemen that was very much involved in that process is sitting right here, Mr. Mansour. And there's no compact. There's never ever been one. And if there is a compact, if there ever was one, no Congress can bind another Congress. And that's a reality. And what about Public Law 600? Let me tell you how that worked. You see, Congress passed a law that said Puerto Rico can write its own constitution. But it had to be approved by Congress, and it could be modified by Congress at any moment. You know what that's like? How many of you here have ever been under 21? How many of you have never been under 21? Okay. I'm glad somebody's listening. Anyway, you know, and you're out there, let's say that you went to Georgetown University or whatever, and here you just can't wait to reach age 21, and so you can go party in the bars in Georgetown. and you finally reach age 21, okay? And you proudly go to the guy at the door in the bar at Georgetown, and you hand him your driver's license, and he says, and you say, now I can finally get in. And he looks at you and he says, well, I'm sorry, but because you're Puerto Rican, you have to get your mother's permission, written permission, to get into this bar. That's what Public Law 600 basically says, okay? To me, it wasn't Public Law 600. To me, the PL stands for pretty lame. Now, talking about Georgetown, let me talk about another Georgetown. And this Georgetown is about 45 minutes from where I live now in Colorado, in Vale, Colorado. And this is a mining town. What's interesting, Oscar Wilde used to spend about a couple of months a year there. I can't figure out why an intellectual giant like Oscar Wilde will want to spend in a cold, miserable mining town in the middle of Colorado. Has nothing but 1,000 young men and no women. Anyway, today Georgetown is a little different kind of a place. It's kind of a cute little town. It has nice little shops, antique shops and so on. And I'm browsing through one of the shops, and I find a 1859 compilation of Harper's magazine. And an article in that Harper's really gets my attention. And here's what the title of it was: The Dividing Line Between Federal and Local Authority, Popular Sovereignty in the Territories. And here's one of the first quotes, one of the first paragraphs from this magazine. The political organization that was formed in 1854 and has assumed this name of the Republican Party is based on the theory that African slavery, as it exists in this country, is an evil of such magnitude as to justify and require the exertion of the entire power of the federal government to implement its extinction. Boy, these liberal Republican do-gooders act like a bunch of pinko commies, don't they? Imagine trying to expropriate your own property that you worked so hard to acquire. Those were my slaves. I paid for them. They belong to me. The article also goes on and cites issues of slave ownership, and it relates it to property ownership. And it talks about how the federal government can only step in if a slave happens to escape from his master, crosses the state line, and only then does the federal government have the obligation to protect the slave, this property. Okay? Now, the article concludes and it says, every distinct political community loyal to the Constitution is entitled to all the rights, privileges, and immunities of self-government in respect to their local concerns and internal policy. Now, a couple of million people died over this argument over the next 10 years. Well, you know what's interesting is that before the American Civil War, the concept of a Commonwealth perhaps might have existed. Now, Congress was fair to slavery, and they listened to those arguments. Do we have to be fair to colonialism just like we were fair to slavery? Well, yes. As a matter of fact, there's a proponent of the territorial status or of this status right here on the panel. But, you know, I heard it from a good source that he is actually in favor of free association. And I congratulate him for that, and he has my support 100%. But what's the connection? We're talking about sovereignty here. It's really a shame that an area of 4 million people could not have sovereignty. In essence, if Puerto Rico wanted to adopt any kind of legislation, like, for example, implementing a $3 minimum wage, could it do it? No, because the federal government overrides it. And where are the members of Congress that vote in U.S. Congress that would help lobby for that issue? It can't. Puerto Rico has no sovereignty. If it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, a colony. And anyone who thinks different is smoking wacky tobacco. The authors of this article used legal arguments to justify slavery. You know, we're a nation of laws. It didn't work. Morality prevailed after a few million people died. Proponents of this colonial status that they call Commonwealth used legal arguments to justify its existence. Just as with slavery, colonialism doesn't pass the moral smell test, no matter how much you cloak it in legal mumbo-jumbo. America was the last major country to give up slavery. Will it be the last to give up colonialism? Especially when it costs U.S. taxpayers $22 billion a year, of which $400 every year is my money. And then the opponents of change say, Puerto Ricans don't want change. 3% vote for independence and less than 50% vote for statehood. Bull. Wrong spin. The real issue is that federal taxes. Almost 50% are willing to pay federal taxes and about 50% don't want to pay federal taxes. If the people of Colorado, the state where I now live, were asked the same question, how would you like to get all the federal benefits and never have to pay federal taxes? I'll bet 99% of it would say, give me that free lunch yesterday. But the reality is that there is no free lunch. 50% of the people of Puerto Rico are below the official poverty line because the economy is stymied by these colonial handcuffs. And American taxpayers are picking up the tab. I think it's time this despicable condition came to a screeching halt. Both the U.S. taxpayers and people of Puerto Rico deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deschlitzi. Our next guest will be presenting the case for the Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth. Luis Vega Ramos has been an active player in Puerto Rican public affairs for several years. He is a law graduate from the University of Puerto Rico, where he also earned his bachelor's degree in social sciences with a concentration in political science. In the year 2000, he authored the book La Nación en Asociación, A Nation in Association, which explains the historical, political, legal, and economic aspects of his status proposal. In the upcoming weeks, Vega Ramos will be publishing his next book, Entre Fraude y Dignidad, Between Fraud and Dignity, which chronicles the controversial 2004 gubernatorial campaign and election of Puerto Rico, along with its legal and political aftermaths. From 1995 to 2003, Mr. Vega Ramos was president of Proela, a civic organization that for 29 years has advocated the development of current Commonwealth status towards a clearly non-colonial and non-territorial association between Puerto Rico and the United States. As such, he has taken part in several initiatives to push forward the status issue, actively engaging Congress, the executive branch, and the Puerto Rican electorate on a number of times. From 2001 to 2003, Mr. Vega Ramos was the director of the Office of Legislative and Legal Counsel of the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Puerto Rico. In 2004, he served as municipal legislator of San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, for the Popular Democratic Party. Currently, he is in the private practice of his profession as an attorney at law and is also a political commentator on the program Reacción Inmediata, transmitted by the Radio Isla Network. He also serves as member of the Constitutional Development Commission of the Puerto Rico Bar Association, which has been one of the foremost defenders of a special Puerto Rican Constitutional Status Assembly that would engage Congress and the administration in a meaningful process to solve the status issue. Please welcome Mr. Luis Vega Ramos.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias y buenas tardes. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank and congratulate the School of Public Affairs of American University for putting forth this platform so that a very serious and important issue can be addressed. And obviously, I want to also congratulate Jose Luis for taking the time and the effort to make this happen. So, and I think it's very important that whatever curves we take in this road, we never stop moving till we get to the finish line. So thank you very much for providing another opportunity. I hope that after the presentation that Jose Luis just read, Alex has clear what my position is. If not, I hope that in 15 minutes you have clear what my position is. As I said, I'm going to talk about Estado Libre Asociado, but I'm going to talk about a sovereign, non-territorial, developed Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth. For 107 years, Puerto Ricans have attempted to extract from Congress a full and effective exercise in self-determination. we have yet to succeed. Along the way, we have managed to obtain some conquests, but the fundamental nature of the relationship with the United States remains an unfinished affair. And that's an affair that needs to be dealt with. That's an affair that needs to be dealt with responsibly through a process of consensus building and not a process of partisan and political bashing. First and foremost, and above all other considerations, it must be understood that Puerto Rico, above everything else, is a nation, a distinct and unique nation. We have our own culture, history, and identity, and as you can see by my thick accent, we speak our own language. Any status proposition that ignores this reality will be ineffective or dangerous to the political stability of the United States-Puerto Rico relationship. The very nature of self-determination abhors the idea of the obliteration of its protagonist. And that's something that needs to be taken care and needs to be understood for this issue to move forward with success. Secondly, it also must be understood that the majority of Puerto Ricans view their U.S. citizenship as a right won through our interaction with the United States and as the most personal example of our common bond with that nation. Its preservation for future generations is not seen as incompatible with our desire for more political authority in our own hands. It may seem contradictory to want to be Puerto Rican nationals and at the same time be U.S. citizens. But that contradiction is precisely the result of the acts and the omission of the Congress of the United States during the last 107 years. That paradox should be confronted and addressed reasonably. So in a sense, it is my strong belief, and that's what I'm going to be advocating in the next couple of minutes, that the only or the best solution for the Puerto Rican political status dilemma is a solution that takes into consideration Puerto Rico's status as a nation, as a cultural, language, historical nation, and its desire and need to preserve that. Secondly, it takes into consideration that through our particular interaction over the last 107 years, Puerto Rico wishes to retain a special economic, political, juridical, and citizenship relationship with the United States. And third, and not least important, that the nature of that relationship should be clearly outside the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution and should be based in a bilateral accord of complete legal validity. From 1898 to 1950, the United States ruled Puerto Rico with almost total disregard for Puerto Ricans. The island and its inhabitants were clearly viewed as property of the federal government. Nobody doubted that we were a colonial possession or an unincorporated territory. That changed somewhat in 1952 with the establishment of the present relationship. In the intervening years, many things have improved in Puerto Rico, but some old problems still remain. The main issue of the U.S.-Puerto Rico relationship is that the general consent offered in 1952 has subjected Puerto Rico to legislation approved by a body in which it has no representation and signed by a president for which it doesn't vote. Furthermore, it has become evident that for important sectors in the U.S. legislative, executive, and judicial branches, Puerto Rico still remains a territory subject to Congress plenary powers. In order for Commonwealth to grow, this flaw, whether true or perceived, must be corrected. Congress still holds the final word, and the federal courts have final interpretation. An unacceptable degree of imposition still prevails. This, however, and I strongly stress however, should not be construed to mean that Commonwealth has not brought positive changes to Puerto Rico. Through the last 5 decades, we have adopted our own constitution, life expectancy, education, health, and other quality of living issues have progressed, and we have benefited from our economic and political ties to one of the global superpowers. But as this new century moves forward with a different set of demands, it is clear that the time for tutelage is over. The authority that we have under Commonwealth must be strengthened. It must not be reduced. The best way to correct the present democratic deficit, as a former governor of Puerto Rico has put it, is to empower the Commonwealth status, the current Commonwealth status, through a new compact of association that recognizes clearly and that establishes clearly Puerto Rico's non-territorial status, and that states equally in clear terms the limits of legitimate federal intervention and federal action in Puerto Rican affairs. The pro-Commonwealth governor of Puerto Rico, the current governor of Puerto Rico, the Honorable Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, has expressed a clear understanding of these issues. In his February 11th letter to the President of the United States, and in the bill that he had previously sent to the Puerto Rican legislature, he stated his position that all options, including Commonwealth, have to be of a non-colonial and non-territorial nation. I believe that's a stride in the right direction, and I believe that even though there are some logistical and procedural problems in Puerto Rico, the fact that the governor of Puerto Rico, who is for Commonwealth, that the president of the Independence Party of Puerto Rico, and that the president of the New Progressive Party of Puerto Rico, all are saying, even if it's through different channels, that the options should be non-colonial and non-territorial, should move us to action. The problem is that many times in this debate, partisan politics here and in Puerto Rico get the better of us. As stated, the only way to enter into a binding bilateral compact with the federal government is to be outside the territorial clause. The U.S. has already done this on 3 occasions since 1986 with the Federated State of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. And I'm sure Manasseh Mansour and Manuel, who has written about that as well, can also talk about that. Those are clear examples of political associations with the United States that are outside of the territorial clause and that provide for stable, dignified, and operational relationships between those associated states and the government of the United States. The fundamental quality of those agreements is that the delegation is of a specific, particularized, written down nature. It's not a general delegation as Puerto Rico consented to in 1952, but rather it states specifically the areas in which the associated state accepts some form of delegation or some form of federal intervention in exchange, obviously, for considerations in economical and political matters. This precedent needs not to be duplicated exactly for Puerto Rico. Rather, it gives us a bold parameter for the establishment of a clearly non-territorial relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. What needs to be ascertained is the level of political support and will that this type of parameter could generate here in Washington and in Puerto Rico, and how it would fit with Puerto Rico's needs and realities. For that, we need a fair and effective process. We have yet to have one. Let me briefly comment on some other aspects of that proposal. Recognizing Puerto Rico's specific authority to conduct its foreign trade relations will allow new economic opportunities for us. Additionally, a guarantee in the compact to maintain the present level of federal funding for a reasonable amount of years will promote, if used correctly, the Puerto Rican economy. That way, Puerto Rico will grow as a viable player in the globalization game. Also, there is no legal or constitutional impediment that forbids the compact from guaranteeing U.S. citizenship of those living in Puerto Rico and their offspring. In fact, the official analysis of the existing Compact of Free Association acknowledges correctly U.S. law regarding dual citizenship. So the issue is not whether a citizenship scenario that permits an expedition transmission of U.S. citizenship to future generations of Puerto Rico can be agreed upon. It can be agreed upon, but rather, which is the best way of doing it. Again, it's not a constitutional question, but a question of sound policy. And many fear-mongers here and in Puerto Rico are truly afraid of a debate about sound policy. The establishment of a compact of association will also solve the issue of Puerto Rican nationality, offering Puerto Rico a true non-territorial partnership with the United States will make annexation moot. Congress would never avert a statehood petition. Congress would then avert, a statehood petition for the wrong reasons from a 500-year-old Spanish-speaking Caribbean nation. For the United States, the compact must preserve its legitimate interests. The determination of those legitimate interests, particularly in defense and security matters, must be the result of negotiation. I believe that the U.S. has 5 main objectives of its relationship in Puerto Rico that it wishes to preserve. Retain certain defense and security rights over Puerto Rico, preserve Puerto Rico as a close ally, curtail current dependency on federal funds, programs, and agencies that turn the tide towards a more self-sufficient Puerto Rico, keep Puerto Rico as one of its top export markets, and solve in a conclusive way the status question so that future Congresses will not have to constantly revisit this issue. All these objectives can be secured through a compact like accord that does not demand incorporation. We can be partners. Under your system of law, we can be partners without being your wards. For Puerto Rico, the Compact of Association must clarify our political dignity, empower us to face the current century, and guarantee the main elements of our current relationship with the United States, which are citizenship, common market, common currency, and mutual defense. All of this has been done before, as I stated, by the United States. There is, after all, little new under the sun. But the threshold issue is not the content of the compact. Many people will have you believe that that's the threshold issue that we should take upon, but that is not the threshold issue that we should be dealing with this at this stage. The fundamental question is how to move both Puerto Rico and the US Congress towards effective action. And we have been at it as a nation for 107 years. I have been at it for 16 years of my life. Manuel has been at it for more years than I care to tell. So has Carlos and others here and outside, and it's time to try to fashion a problem. So has Jeff too, and Manasseh. It's time to try to fashion a process that permits us to take care of other considerations and put this one behind us. But there are several ways, some good and some extremely bad. Local Puerto Rican plebiscites have not been the way. Congressional bills have floated around from time to time with no success. So what should we do if we want to solve this dilemma? The pro-Commonwealth governor has proposed to ask the people of Puerto Rico to choose between having the political parties come back here to Congress with the same process looking for legislation, or calling for a special constitutional convention on status that would serve as a more effective tool to engage the U.S. The pro-statehood legislature in Puerto Rico did not back that plan and instead passed a bill that provided for a vote this year. It would have demanded from Congress to solve the issue between non-colonial and non-territorial formulas. A moral commitment was given by the pro-statehood legislators to the effect that if this Congress did not respond, it would proceed to consult the people with regards to the Constitutional Assembly on status. With that, the bill was approved unanimously. Then, several pro-statehood leaders went back on their word as to the possibility of a future Constitutional Assembly. That forced a veto from the governor of Puerto Rico, who is presenting new legislation. I can sadly say that the reaction from the majority leader of the Senate to the new legislation presented by the governor was that in the middle of the session yesterday, he tore it up in the middle of that session and in front of his desk. That's no way to responsibly deal with this issue. There may be differences, but the time for childlike partisan politics is over. We don't need a majority leader in the Senate tearing down legislation. We need people sitting down in tables to talk. As long as the political parties in Puerto Rico are not willing to enter into a real give and take and fashion a consensus, we are doomed to repeat past failures. Instead of a mad partisan sprint to Congress, it is time for the three principal political leaders of Puerto Rico to sit at the same table. Pedro Rosselló, Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, and Rubén Berríos Martínez. They should sit together at the same time at the same table and with no intermediaries to see if there's a possibility for a Puerto Rican plan of action instead of 3 parties and 1. As for the options, I still believe that a non-territorial association between Puerto Rico and the United States is the best, most peaceful, intelligent, and dignified way to find our best future through this type of partnership that I advocate between Puerto Rico and the United States. That is why, and with this I conclude, I have come to you here today, and I've done it for many years, to support what President William Jefferson Clinton called in a letter that he sent to me several years ago, Puerto Rican nationhood in close association with the United States. I believe that that's the best solution for you. I believe it's the best solution for Puerto Rico. I believe it's the most effective way to deal with this century-long dilemma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vega Ramos. Our next guest will be presenting the case for independence. Manuel Rodriguez Orellana was born in Rio Piedras, Puerto Rico. He has a Bachelor of Arts from Johns Hopkins University and a Master's of Arts from Brown University, as well as a Juris Doctor from Boston College of Law and a Master's in Law from Harvard University. Mr. Orellana is a former professor of law at Northeastern University School of Law in Boston and the Inter-American University of Puerto Rico School of Law. He has also been a visiting scholar at the Harvard Law School and guest lecturer at various colleges and universities in the U.S. mainland and Puerto Rico. Among his public service experience, Mr. Orellana was a former senator and minority leader of the Puerto Rican Independence Party in the Puerto Rico Senate, and later in 2000 became a candidate for the federal position of resident commissioner in Washington, D.C. He was a former electoral commissioner for the Puerto Rican Independence Party between 1989 and 1995. Counsel to the minority leader of the Puerto Rican Independence Party in the Senate of Puerto Rico from 1995 to 1999, and currently since February 2005. He was also a member of the Governor's Dialogue Committee on Puerto Rico Status process between 1989 and 1991. Mr. Orellana is currently the Secretary of North American Relations for the Puerto Rican Independence Party, and he has written several law review articles on decolonization and international law for various academic law journals in the U.S. and Puerto Rico during the past 20 years. He is a frequent columnist for the San Juan Star and other newspapers in Puerto Rico and the U.S. mainland. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Manuel Rodriguez Orellana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Dean Leo Grande, fellow panel members, ladies and gentlemen. The chairman forgot to mention one thing in my biography. I spent 6 weeks in federal prison for fighting against the abuses of the U.S. Navy in the island municipality of Vieques by conducting peaceful civil disobedience. And I am more proud of that than any of the other things on that bio. I wish to address, I can see several compatriots here, but there are also some Americans in the audience, and some Americans who will be listening to this recording later on. So I would like to address particularly, since we are all friends and neighbors, to quote President George W. Bush a few years ago, I would like to address our friends and neighbors, our American friends and neighbors. And I want to do this in a very straightforward and open way, because your true friends will not tell you what you want to hear, but only your true friends will tell you the truth. So I'm here to tell you some things that we need to focus on, not the differences that Luis Vega Ramos and Carlos Chardon and I have, which are indeed political differences. I will not fight partisan politics by being drawn into them. But I think that we need to start out by making it very clear that this colonial mess that we're in was created by you, the Americans. It is the Americans who took over Puerto Rico without a referendum, without a vote, without federal legislation, and turned Puerto Rico into a military colony until the end of the Third World War, which is the Cold War. Once the Cold War is over, the use of the military colony is no longer there. So the old military colony has become just a plain, simple, unabashed colony. And we need to put an end to that. You need to put an end to that. Mr. Vega Ramos already went into some of the history of Puerto Rico, and I cannot emphasize enough the fact that we are sociologically, culturally, historically, a distinct people. In other words, a nation, a Latin American nation of the Caribbean. I know that Alex does not believe in nations or in nationalities, but you know, the United States is the best example that in fact nationalities do exist. In fact, I learned to become really a nationalist in my experience here in the United States during the Vietnam War years, because my classmates were dead set against that war, and they fought with such verve for peace because they loved their country. And it made me envious in a kind of healthy way. Gee, why can't I also criticize what is wrong in my country to make it better? So nationalism does exist, and it's been flourishing in Puerto Rico. In fact, the Puerto Rican national character, I think, has been strengthened over the last 40, 50, and 60 years, at the same time that the military colony prevailed in Puerto Rico. Throughout the century, concurrently with the empires that came and went, we saw the rise of nationalist ideologies throughout the world. And if you judge just by looking at an article that was in this morning's Washington Post, we're still there. And the United States is not being left out. Independence is the natural pathway for nationalities to take. And I, of course, favor independence. And Puerto Rico, it can be no and should be no different from any other nationality. It's the only, in my way of thinking, flexible, stable, and permanent solution to our becoming better friends and neighbors. But in this process of strengthening of Puerto Rico's nationality, of Puerto Rico's national character, there has also been an increase in the search for political power, because Puerto Rico is a nation without political sovereignty. It is a nation without the political power that comes with sovereignty. But Puerto Rico has always been searching for that completion of its nationality. And I dare say all three of us, representing different status options here, are in search for that political power. Let me just give you an example. Mr. Carlos Chardon, who will be speaking shortly to you, is representing the position of stateholders seeking equal treatment within the American constitutional system. Well, not really, because he knows that Puerto Rico as a state would continue to have its legal processes in Spanish, its judicial processes in Spanish, and I don't think any stateholder would dare say or try to sell statehood in Puerto Rico by saying that public education will be in English in Puerto Rico. So let's start by eliminating some myths and clearing the air. Also, the kind of state that Puerto Rico would become would be one that Mr. Odysseylitze may have pointed to in a kind of unawares manner, and that is that Puerto Rico would be receiving more federal funds and paying less in federal taxes than most of the states of the Union. Also, Puerto Rico would have more power in the Congress than most states in the Union. So you see, we are seeking more political power. And it's more political power to determine our own future. The United States also has a right to self-determination. Once you don't exercise self-determination once, and that's it. It is a continuing process, and so in this process, the United States should be aware of the fact that it is incorporating into its body politic, if it chooses to go the statehood route, a foreign element that does not fit well. Commonwealth, or ELA in any of its various formulations, has asked for parity in federal funds, recognition of sovereignty for trade and commerce, and the power of nullification. Not Mr. Vega Ramos. Mr. Vega Ramos believes in free association, but the party that he belongs to, the official position or the official definition, calls for a permanent compact from which the United States can never ever get rid itself of, and yet for Puerto Rico to have the power of nullification. By the way, an issue over which the United States went to civil war. In other words, that we decide which federal laws apply in Puerto Rico and which do not. So we are seeking more political power. You might say that statehooders and these Commonwealthers want their cake and eat it too. I think that's not true. I think they want our cake and yours too. But the fact that we are seeking political power does not end there. We have been exercising our request and our quest and our demands for political power. And Vieques is the best example of that in recent days. People from all walks of life, from all religions, from all social classes, from all ideologies, and from all political parties practiced peaceful civil disobedience to kick the Navy out of Vieques. And we did it. But most recently, all of the elected representatives of Puerto Rico, all of them in the Puerto Rican legislature, approved the following bill. It read that the United States would be confronted with the following statement: we, the people of Puerto Rico, in the exercise of our right to self-determination, demand from the President and Congress of the United States of America an expression of their commitment to respond to the people of Puerto Rico's claim to solve their political status among fully democratic options of a non-colonial and non-territorial nature. In other words, populares, statehooders, commonwealthers of the various shades, independentistas, everybody in the elected position in the legislature of Puerto Rico, everybody voted in favor of this to demand that the United States end Puerto Rico's colonial status. You created the mess, you have to handle it. You have to assume the responsibility, you have to get your act together. We are tired of being told in Puerto Rico that we have to get our act together. Oh, our act is pretty much together. We want decolonization. By and large, the majority of the people of Puerto Rico want decolonization. What we need is for the United States to get its act together and get on the road. The argument may be brought up that that statement that I just read to you did not pass. Well, it passed. It's just that one person, the governor, did not sign it. So it's not law, but it is a political fact, and we are dealing with political realities. So we should not simply consider that because the governor was forced not to sign it, was forced to back down after he committed himself publicly on more than one occasion, after he sent message after message to the legislature that he would sign the bill, after his knees were bent and he was brought to his knees, that just because he didn't sign it, that this political fact did not occur. It did occur. It's there. It's never going to go away. As I said, Puerto Rico as a colony, or as a colony with congressional representation and with a vote for federal office, would still be a bad fit, I think, for the United States. We are in a process of constant cultural affirmation, and it would be a process of a constant threat of secession, Caribbean Quebec, if you like, and a constant source of political instability. And political instability is bad for business. We need something that will be more reliable than congressional legislation, as you Americans well know. And that is a treaty. And that is why in 1945 there were 73 nations, independent nations in the world, and today there are 193. And it is through treaties that countries can join forces to move forward and to develop economically and to grow economically. Colonial continuation is a denial of democracy, subservience as a way of life. Bear in mind that the solution to Puerto Rico has to take into account Puerto Ricans' loyalty and primary loyalty. And here I am reminded, because it's not the first time that we are here in the United States discussing status, how 15 years ago we tried an approach, and Manasseh was there and Jeff was there, to get Congress to enact self-executing legislation, to make good on their word that self-determination was the policy of the United States and that they would grant whatever the people of Puerto Rico chose. And of course, that didn't happen. But we had some very interesting conversations and very interesting discussions. And I remember a meeting we had with a gentleman, truly a gentleman, Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, and a prominent Puerto Rican politician of the statehood persuasion was trying to kid Senator Bentsen, cajole the president of the Independence Party and the president of the Commonwealth Party into believing that, after all, this nationality thing doesn't matter. And he said, looking at Senator Bentsen, see, take Senator Bentsen, for instance. Senator Bentsen is a Texan first and an American second, just like I am a Puerto Rican first and an American second. And Senator Bentsen kindly looked at him and said, and I have to say this because I did not know Senator Bentsen well. Senator Bentsen was not a friend of mine. He said, no, in Texas we are Americans first and Americans second. Well, let me tell you, we Puerto Ricans are not Lloyd Bentsen. I think the economics of independence are something that could take up another half an hour. And I will save some of that for the question and answer period. But let me just say this with regards to economics. In the last 30 years, dozens of countries, smaller than Puerto Rico, equally populated or more overpopulated than Puerto Rico, have developed economically better and faster than Puerto Rico in the same period of time, and have gone over and beyond Puerto Rico's economic development. In that same period of time, Puerto Rico has not surpassed anyone. So there is something wrong in the systemic situation that we're facing. I forget what the red card means, how much time I have left, but I don't worry about it. I'm going to stop here because I'd rather continue this conversation to the question and answer period. But bear in mind, my job here is to tell you the truth, because we are your friends and neighbors, and you created this mess, and you clean it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez Orellana. Our next guest will be presenting the case for statehood. Development of non-governmental organizations and programs in government service agencies is a unifying factor of Carlos Chardon's professional achievements. While studying for a doctorate, he was a civil service employee of the New York State Division for Civil Rights. He had just taken the doctoral examinations when he was called by newly elected Governor Luis A. Ferré to join his staff of advisors. Shortly after, he asked to organize and head a new agency as executive director of the State Board of Education. 3 years after, he was asked to organize a U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare office in Puerto Rico in response to the claims of the state government of discrimination of Puerto Ricans by this federal agency. He served 2 different local political administrations in a civil service position that required approval of the state governor. He had just turned 38 when he was appointed Secretary of Education of Puerto Rico, in charge of the 4th largest school district in the nation. By 1980, when he left, he had become a leader within the Education Commission of the states and the chief state school officers, achieving a 100% increase in elementary and secondary education funds after negotiations with the congressional delegations of the most populous states. At the time, he also presided the 3rd Ibero-American Conference on Education and was decorated by Spain in the Ibero-American Office on Education. On leaving the state government, he joined the Ponce Museum of Art as its executive vice president. At the time, he chaired the Conservatory of Music of Puerto Rico, my alma mater, and several other statewide organizations. He became one of the prime movers behind the Puerto Rico Academy of Arts and Sciences. He returned to federal government in 1988 in charge of the Caribbean office of the U.S. Small Business Administration. He became the principal spokesperson for small businesses in Puerto Rico, being honored by the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, regionally and nationally. Locally, he received the Puerto Rico Retailers Association Mercury Award. In 1996, he accepted the challenge of presiding the board of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. From 1994 until 2000, he was a consultant for the state government in helping redevelop businesses in traditional town centers. He was also a member of the State Board of Experts. From 2000 on, he has worked exclusively with the private sector and is currently a member of the U.S. Census Hispanic Advisory Committee. Please welcome Dr. Carlos Chardon.
I really want to thank the American University to give me a chance to hear myself, because that's the only reason I speak out to groups like this. I just like to hear myself, so bear with me. You know, much is said about there being a relationship in the nature of a compact, or a compact between Puerto Rico and the US. And discussing this issue is just about as useful as arguing over the number of angels on the head of a pin. No one really cares anymore. I think it more useful to approach our relationship with the US from a totally practical point of view. Forget about what they've written about it. I like to think of it as a contract. There's a contract, a de facto contract. There are products in that contract, and of course there's fine print in that contract. And we all know we've got to change that contract because of the products and the fine print. And I'd like to also to conclude, suggest the products to expect from a new contractual relationship with the US. For the need of a new contract, you know, in 1852, a former slave, Frederick Douglass, chastised the 2 principal political parties, accusing them of hypocrisy because they boasted of their love of liberty, superior civilization, and Christianity, and allowed 3 million persons to be enslaved in the nation. This is 2005. And 3.8 million American citizens in Puerto Rico cannot vote for those that send us to war, make the laws, and appoint and confirm judges of the nation. This is not freedom. We're protected by the US Constitution, but we cannot participate in amending it. It's not ours. We're subjects of America, and citizens of America. We're separate and unequal, and truly the children of Plessy versus Ferguson. Not all is negative, okay? Initially, Commonwealth was a metaphor for freedom, like a poem to T.S. Eliot. Commonwealth was to be enjoyed before it was ever understood. But after the death of its poet founders, subjection to the U.S. became unpalatable. We're not free. We're not enslaved. Yet we're tied to the rest of the nation by bonds stronger than chains: citizenship, community, family, market, federal funds, and the dead in our military cemeteries. They're not any less binding or less strong than shackles. Now for the contract. During the early 20th century, Congress tried to assimilate Puerto Rico through the public schools. Policy was successful in that we adapted and reworked many of its institutions. Nevertheless, for the first half of the century, even though we were American citizens and we were enjoying its institutions, we were somewhat alien. But after World War II in Korea, the soldiers coming back from the front refused to go back to their hometowns. The end result is that the market and migration to and from the states achieved what Congress could not do. These personal, familial, communal, social ties are so strong as to present an almost insurmountable obstacle to any real development but statehood. Now, over half of our population lives stateside. Of this population, part of it is much more at ease in English and Spanish, and they don't feel any less Puerto Rican than anyone in this table. Also, there seems to be more independence advocates stateside than in Puerto Rico. I don't know what that means. But clearly, yes, Manuel, there is a nation, an English-speaking Puerto Rican nation within a nation, right here, and is 4 million strong. In Puerto Rico, we tend to vote status. Our elections thus reflect the disgust of 80% of the registered voters with a relationship with the federal government. In the end, it's all for nothing. Congress has ultimate control. There's little we can do about it. Now for the fine print. Yes, there's a lot of money in Puerto Rico. Economic growth is irrefutable. Development, well, that's something else. As a per capita standard of living falls in relation to former British Caribbean colonies, local bankers and developers joined the ranks of Forbes' lists of billionaires. There is money in Puerto Rico. The federal government has been particularly generous to Puerto Rico, so generous that 22% of personal income and 26% of net income in Puerto Rico is due to federal transfers. Effectually and effectively, Congress has quieted protest in Puerto Rico with money. More importantly, Congress will continue to spend and increase transfers, Alex, to Puerto Rico as long as the island hosts American and multinational corporate giants enjoying federal taxes, federal tax exemptions. By the 60s, nevertheless, we knew economic development, as defined by Congress, was not going anywhere. And Congress would not give us the political power to change it. So the local political elites dropped their strategy of development and settled for get what you can from Whitey. Development not being truly possible, they settled for the illusion of development. Federal transfers came in regularly. They were there for the asking and took away uncertainty, but they also altered the morality of our leadership. Their work ethic eventually gave way to a take what you can and run ethic. Mindful of the effects of uncertainty, our political elites developed a Mickey Mouse world. We invented another Disney world. And we invented the fact, and statehood would say you can get anything under statehood, and independence the same, and associate republic or Commonwealth, MENA, and we invented MENA. Is it MENA or MANA? The biblical word for the...
Manna.
MANA, okay, MANA. MANA is American citizenship for Puerto Ricans, federal transfers, no federal taxes, Free access for products and persons to and from the nation, saying which federal tax laws will apply, and elimination of federal courts in Puerto Rico, Spanish only, and international presence, anything you can think of. But please, no responsibility. Disregard for requests for political change, as reasonable as they may have been, generate a steady, low-energy anger at the grassroots level. It hardened into riots and marches in Vieques, leading a president facing re-election to declare that that naval base was unnecessary. Very wise move. Very many votes. So what happened then? In the end, Vieques embodied all the ills wrought by the federal government in Puerto Rico and none of the bounties. Well, you don't have to be a nationalist to protest abuse. And this is what happened in Vieques. This and very many other things. Now let's get back to Commonwealth and resentment. Massive federal transfers, massive failures of economic development. The Operation Bootstrap turned into a boondoggle. Let's see what is the balance. One of the balances, we have very many different sets of books in Puerto Rico. In the 1950s, employment to population ratio was 90% of the US average. Now it's 65% and dropping. Thank you, Commonwealth. The employment rate within working ages has gone down from 49% in 50 to 36% in 1980. Thank you, Commonwealth. Male labor participation went down from 85% in 50 to 58% in 2003. Thank you, Commonwealth. Average income in relation to the poor state is going down. Wow, thank you, Commonwealth. 40% of the population is on food stamps. Wow, that's a lot of money. Thank you, Commonwealth. 1/3 of the gainfully employed is on the government payroll. In fact, government in Puerto Rico, thanks to the federal funds and congressional generosity and Congress's willingness to quiet us down with money, what's happened is that government now in Puerto Rico is another program of welfare. There is government welfare in Puerto Rico, and it's called government employment. Due diligence, okay? Now, let's get to statehood. You know, it's fair to ask, why in the world do you want to be a state if the political elites in Puerto Rico and the federal government have treated you the way they've treated you? Man, why don't you just become a Puerto Rican citizen instead of an American citizen? That's fair. Well, we've been American citizens since 17. We've had a significant presence in every war since World War I. We have fought and died for it, and we aim to keep the citizenship. We earned it. It's ours. Furthermore, we vote in presidential National Party primaries, and our economy is fully integrated into that of the USA. Still, life under Commonwealth has cost us dearly. The idea of the nation and the national now belongs to consumer America. You see the traditional nationalist symbols in Puerto Rico more oftentimes in cigarette and beer ads than you see them anywhere else. Nationalist in Puerto Rico is baile, baraja, y botella because it was taken over by Madison Avenue, and we have not been able to take a hold of it ourselves. They're just too strong. We've lost it. We've lost our symbols to the market. The national has become a collectible. It's also good business. The idea of a beleaguered past, a laborious present, and a triumphant future is gone from the Puerto Rican psyche. Nationalism, as a product of a wounded national conscience, is gone because the conscience is gone. We were bought off. Under Commonwealth and administrative state, doling services and benefits substituted the state as a moral and ethical commitment to freedom and liberty. Commonwealth has brought about the loss of self-respect, for it can only take, not give. The support for independence or full autonomy no longer is based on the defense of the nation state. That never was. It is based on the steady low-level resentment against Congress and the federal executive. And here we can all agree. We needed the statecraft that was killed by Commonwealth and can no longer be found in independence. Statecraft is a form of soulcraft, for it shapes the culture of character, the identity and the soul of a people, the sense of nationality and high purpose that engenders worthy patriotism. Man needs the collective representations that frame his being, yet the administrative state destroyed the culture of character. There's a lot of craft in our political leaders, but there's very little soul. Can we grow beyond the exclusivity of the nationalisms of the past into a people principally attuned to work? Can we reconceive the state as an instrument of a people and not a goal? Can we build on what we have and not on what we have lost? Yes, we can build. Yes, we must build. Personal and community identity is a quest of mankind through history. Going back to a past despoiled by advertising is not an option. Commonwealth, however defined, is a black hole in space. It absorbs and destroys everything that comes near it. It degraded the concept of the national. It degrades the ideal of America because it's predicated on gimme, 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 and no give. Generalized support of American citizenship is a key building block to a new sense of purpose, and as much as is our generosity as a people, so is our commitment to life and to the family. Our work ethic also lives often hidden in the informal economy, hidden from over-regulation and bureaucratic excess. We're religious. You know, there's more churches per square mile in Puerto Rico than anywhere else in the nation. And all of this ties us into a culture not tied to nationalism, but to the stable element of human experience. We know who we are. And we know we're good. And we know we can be even better. Of course, Congress could make short shrift of this possibility. It could give American citizenship to citizens of the new republic or associated republic. It could continue to flood the islands with funds. It could continue to give anything and everything Congress wants to do. It could give all of this to the gimme, gimme, gimme republic and the gimme, gimme state. But what Congress cannot give anyone is self-respect. And that, I suggest, is the one thing we have to go after. Why would we want statehood if we don't pay federal personal and corporate income tax? Well, under the current arrangement, we are allowed to eat all we can eat as long as we stay in the kitchen. Some of us enjoy it. But it's no substitute for self-esteem. If we can pay our way, why take for Congress without giving in return like every other citizen? It gives a sense of ownership of the nation. In turn, it generates patriotism. You do not generate patriotism without giving. You kill it with receiving. Federal dollars feed a bloated bureaucracy, begetting regulations that depress small businesses. They depress capital development, forcing them to go underground in order to survive. Once there, they become victims of thievery and corruption rampant in big government. Big government is like a big baby, an alimentary canal with a big appetite at one end and no responsibility at the other. We need a dose of responsibility that gimme, gimme, gimme status will not allow. Statehood is a way out of a sinkhole that widens and deepens as more federal transfers come into Puerto Rico without corresponding responsibility of full federal taxation. Statehood means responsibility. Why would we want statehood if the economic development of Puerto Rico would be crushed on joining the rest of the states? Well, actually, statehood, in spite of federal taxation, would bring about an economic boom. It came about in all of the other states. But wouldn't Puerto Ricans flee en masse to the states if the island became a state? You haven't been to Florida lately, have you? 30 to 35,000 go to Florida every year, and we're a Commonwealth. not a state. And you know why that happens? Our economy cannot develop because there's a ceiling set by our congressional relationship, by our relationship with the states, set by Congress, separate and unequal. We have to let our economy grow. Boy, the one thing that kills statehood, we can't have a Miss Universe. Listen, we can't have a Miss Universe, and we cannot have an Olympic team. Well, I suggest that we can't have. Those are businesses. And anyway, I'm sure that Puerto Rico can produce an Arnold Schwarzenegger to lead the nation if California won't let him go. I'll just quote one final thing. The Commander-in-Chief, in his second inaugural address, America's vital interest and our deepest beliefs are one. From the day of our founding, we have proclaimed that every businessman and woman on earth has a rights and dignity and matchless value because they bear the image of the maker of heaven and earth. Across the generations, we have proclaimed the imperative of self-government because no one is fit to be a master, and no one deserves to be a slave. Advancing these ideals is the mission that created our nation. It is the honorable achievement of our fathers. Now it is the urgent requirement of our nation's security and the calling of our time. I can only close, my fellow Americans, Mr. President. Were we created by another God? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chardon. And after listening to the three status perspectives, I'm glad that Jeffrey Farrow was able to join us. We will proceed with the institutional position of the federal government then. Our next speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Farrow, is a consultant on government affairs in Washington, D.C., serving both federal and private clients. He's associated with Lisboa Incorporated, a public relations firm, begun by his wife, whose family was from Puerto Rico. From 1994 to 2001, Mr. Farrow was the Clinton administration's principal advisor on and coordinator of policy concerning Puerto Rico. During this period, he was also appointed White House co-chair of the interagency group that President Clinton established to advise on policy regarding the 4 other populated territories of the United States, including Mr. Farrow's home of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico's eastern neighbor. Mr. Farrow was recruited by the Clinton White House from the staff of the lead U.S. House of Representatives committee with jurisdiction over territorial affairs. He had served as the committee's principal advisor on territorial issues since 1982. Before becoming staff director of the House Subcommittee on Insular Affairs, Mr. Farrow was coordinator of the Congressional Territorial Caucus in 1981. From 1979 until 1981, Mr. Farrow was a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff, ultimately as Associate Director for Territorial and Small Business Affairs. His other federal appointments have included Insular Areas Coordinator of the 1992-93 Presidential Transition, Senior Advisor to the Department of Commerce, Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, and Executive Director of Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. His first federal position was as Press Assistant to the first delegate of the U.S. House of Representatives from the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the Virgin Islands, Mr. Farrow was elected to the Board of Education and chairman of its Democratic Party in his early 20s. He was also a newspaper editor and publisher at that time. Mr. Farrow has assisted the last 5 Democratic presidential nominees with delegations from territories to national party conventions and served as 2004 candidate John Kerry's advisor on Puerto Rico. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Jeffrey Farrow.
Thank you, Jose, for that generous introduction and as well for organizing this forum. And it is a privilege and a pleasure to appear here with colleagues of long standing, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned. I think it may tell you that we are not very effective at our job because we haven't resolved this issue yet. We've worked on it for so many years. But we continue to work on it, and it is important. I have, as Jose said, been asked to give the federal institutional position on Puerto Rico's status issue. I emphasize this because what I report will not in all cases reflect my own personal preferences. As Jose said, I have advised and represented 2 presidents, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee with jurisdiction over the issue under 5 chairmen, and presidential nominees on the issue. You cannot last in these positions if you do not accurately give them all sides of the story or reflect their views. I've also felt that I had to be precise and as candid as the politics would permit to help Puerto Ricans on the issue. I will make several points. First, Puerto Rico is unincorporated territory of the U.S. Even though it calls its local government the Commonwealth in English and words in Spanish that literally translate into English as Associated Free State. And even though some call its political status Commonwealth, Commonwealth is not a political status per se in a constitutional sense. 4 U.S. states also use the word Commonwealth in the name of their governments. So does another U.S. territory. Puerto Rico is also not a freely associated state, a status in the U.S. and international law under which a territory becomes a sovereign nation but lets a larger nation exercise some of its sovereign powers on the condition that it can unilaterally reclaim the powers. Finally, nor is Puerto Rico a, quote, country, end quote, as the governor calls it, although it certainly can be. In recent years, the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Justice and State Departments, and other federal authorities have all confirmed that Puerto Rico remains subject to the Congress's broad territory governing powers. So have innumerable federal laws. Whatever the name of the status, however, the pertinent point is that it is undemocratic at the national government level. It does not provide equal voting representation in the government that makes and implements Puerto Rico's national laws. Most of its laws, now that the federal government has taken over so much of the responsibility of government. Former Governor Rafael Hernandez Colon, the most influential advocate of Commonwealth for more than 3 decades, hit the nail on the head when he wrote of, quote, the present undemocratic arrangement, unquote. Second point, as unincorporated territory, Puerto Rico's ultimate status is undetermined. The issue will continue as long as the governing arrangement for Puerto Rico is undemocratic. All peoples have a continuing right to a democratic form of government. Third, Puerto Rico's status issue is more of a problem for Puerto Ricans than for the U.S., although it sometimes has been a headache. Puerto Rico has more people than almost half the states. That the states govern Puerto Rico without Puerto Rican votes is more of a problem for Puerto Rico than for the states. That Puerto Rico, with almost half its population below the federal poverty level, receives far less than the states in major programs for aid to the needy is more of a problem for Puerto Ricans than it is for the states. Most important, Puerto Ricans have not asked for a status option or clearly stated that they do not want the islands to remain unincorporated territory. Now, I just said that Puerto Ricans have not asked for a status option, but they have made Commonwealth autonomy proposals in the past. And this brings me to my main point. The issue has not been resolved because of two factors. Number one, unrealistic Commonwealth proposals, and two, local, primarily Commonwealth party politics. Further, federal officials have always responded to Puerto Rican proposals for action on the issue. Commonwealth bills were considered but rejected in 1953, the year after the Commonwealth Constitution was adopted, in 1959 and 1963, and rejected. Commonwealth proposals were also rejected by the highest level Kennedy White House task force. The rejections led to a law for a joint commission that called for a referendum. A Commonwealth proposal won that referendum in 1967. But in 1968, a statehooder was elected governor, turning away from that proposal. That governor was replaced by Governor Hernandez Colón, whom I quoted earlier. Governor Hernandez Colón convinced President Nixon to name a joint advisory group that actually proposed a Commonwealth autonomy proposal. But the proposal was considered and rejected in the Congress in 1976. Additionally, statehooders won the elections that year, further burying the proposal. When some 350,000 Puerto Ricans petitioned for statehood in 1985, the U.S. House Committee with jurisdiction over territorial affairs suggested a referendum among statehood, Commonwealth, and independence options. The re-elected Governor Hernandez Colón pursued the idea in 1989, obtaining commitments from President Bush and the Senate and House chairman for legislation authorizing a referendum. The statehood and independence parties joined in the request. The House and Senate committees approved bills by the end of the 101st Congress, but most of Governor Hernandez Colón's Commonwealth proposals were rejected. When the lead Senate committee split 10 to 10 between two alternative bills in 1991, Governor Hernandez Colón asked the Senate and House chairman to drop the legislation, even though at least one senator offered to switch between the alternatives so that a bill could pass. Puerto Rico held its own referendum under Governor Pedro Rosselló in 1993. A Commonwealth option, quote, won, unquote, even though it did not get a majority of the vote. Further, it made misleading claims about Commonwealth, and it proposed unrealistic economic benefits. Perhaps the most revealing of these was a request for a repeal of a law that had been enacted by Congress just 2 months before, partially taxing income of manufacturers based in the states. In 1985, our administration called for legislation authorizing a referendum among proposals from Puerto Rico's 3 political parties, as agreed to by the federal government. In 1996, the House Committee passed a bill authorizing a choice between the territory's current status and the fully democratic options of nationhood and U.S. statehood. Commonwealthers said that Governor Rosselló's bid for re-election that year would be a referendum on the bill. Rosselló won with a majority that no governor had obtained in 3 decades. A bill with amendments that responded to Commonwealth Party proposals to the maximum extent possible, however, was approved by the House in 1998. But the party, led by the person who is now the governor, Aníbal Acevedo Vila, campaigned against it. Acevedo said he wanted no bill while Rosselló was in office, and an associate added that this would have been the case even if we had accepted the Commonwealth Party's definition of Commonwealth verbatim. Acevedo's campaign lobbied Congress directly and through the most right-wing groups in the United States, objecting to any statehood option for Puerto Rico on the grounds that most Puerto Ricans spoke Spanish and that they had high rates of poverty and high rates of unwed births. It was disgusting. The The bill had substantial bipartisan support in the Senate. However, Acevedo convinced Senate Majority Leaders Lott and Nichols to block votes on the bill. This caused Rosselló to call another local referendum, a Democratic threat to propose an amendment supporting the referendum to every bill the full Senate considered forced Lott and Nichols to back down from their Commonwealth Party-prompted opposition to the resolution. They did not want a public debate against letting an Hispanic community seek statehood. The 1998 referendum included Puerto Rico's 4 real status options: the status quo, statehood, independence, and nationhood in an association with the United States. It also included a none of the above option. Acevedo challenged the referendum in the courts, claiming that it inaccurately described Commonwealth. The challenges failed. He then led his party in adopting a new Commonwealth proposal and said a vote for none of the above would be a vote for the proposal. That proposal called for a constitutional assembly to propose the Commonwealth be recognized as a nation to which the United States is bound. The Commonwealth would have the power to determine the application of federal laws and to enter into international agreements that it cannot enter now, which are international agreements that require national sovereignty. Under the proposal, the U.S. would also continue to grant free entry of goods into the U.S. market from Puerto Rico, citizenship, and all assistance currently granted Puerto Ricans, and appropriate a new annual subsidy for the Commonwealth. None of the above won a bare majority. So in 2000, President Clinton took several steps to clarify Puerto Rico's real status options so that Puerto Ricans could choose. He won enactment of a law providing funding for a Puerto Rican status choice among options proposed by Puerto Rico's Tripartisan Election Commission as agreed to by the Office of the President. The legislation was enacted over Senator Lott's Commonwealth Party-generated opposition, in part because Hispanic constituents pressured the House Republican subcommittee chairman to go along. A presidential task force was established to work with Puerto Rican leaders and congressional committees on the options in the process for Puerto Rico to choose a new status. The task force is to continue to work until Puerto Rico obtains a status that provides a democratic form of government at the national level. In response to requests from the Senate and House committees, we also submitted a report on the status proposals of all 3 parties. The report concluded that Acevedo's Commonwealth proposal was an incompatible combination of aspects of different statuses. It found only minor issues regarding the proposals of the independence and statehood parties. President Bush acted to continue the task force shortly after taking office in 2001. But then Governor Calderon and Acevedo, then Puerto Rico's representative to the federal government, lobbied Bush's staff against implementation of the status choice law and against implementation and activation of the task force. In December 2003, President Bush delayed the deadline for a task force report on progress made in resolving the issue until this December. The Commonwealth Party readopted Acevedo's 1998 Commonwealth proposal in 2004, and in recent weeks he has reiterated that it remains the party's objective. Here are some of the reasons why it is not a status option. Neither the United States nor Puerto Rico would be sovereign nations if they were permanently bound to one another. National sovereignty means that a nation can determine its relations to another nation. There would be havoc if Puerto Rico could unilaterally opt in and opt out of federal laws at its will. Puerto Rico would not really be a nation if all of its people including all those born after it had supposedly become a nation, were to be U.S. citizens. Puerto Ricans would not really want nationhood if they wanted to retain U.S. citizenship. U.S. citizenship presumes primary loyalty to the United States. U.S. citizens in a nation of Puerto Rico would be taxed, and they could be drafted. If Puerto Rico could make its own trade agreements with other countries, but goods could still travel freely from Puerto Rico to the U.S., shipments otherwise prohibited by the U.S. could freely enter the U.S. from Puerto Rico. Fifth point, Puerto Rico's status will change when Puerto Ricans choose a recognized status option or a governing arrangement that federal officials agree can be implemented. Most of the issues in Puerto Rico's status debate are federal questions. It is highly unlikely that a status process in which Puerto Ricans settle on a status proposal unilaterally, such as the Constitutional Assembly Governor Acevedo is pushing now, can succeed. It definitely cannot succeed if the process accomplishes its goal of adopting his Commonwealth proposal. Although Puerto Rican majority support is needed for the territory's status to change, policy changes that would require federal approval that are not options from the federal point of view will not succeed, no matter how extensive their local support. Sixth, Puerto Ricans should understand the alternatives to continued territory status: statehood and nationhood. Statehood is defined by the Constitution of the United States and is equality within the U.S. system. With the increasing Hispanic vote, it would be political suicide for either national party to oppose statehood on the grounds that Puerto Rico is too Hispanic if the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, who have sacrificed so much, ask for statehood. Puerto Ricans should also understand that the United States would go to great lengths to make independence economically viable if Puerto Ricans sought nationhood after a century of relations. Related to this is that Puerto Rico can also become a nation in a true free association with the United States. The U.S. has free association relationships with 3 island groups in the Pacific. A free association relationship with Puerto Rico should be at least as generous as the Pacific Island arrangements, given the much closer relationship that the United States has had with Puerto Rico than it had with the Pacific Islands, which were merely UN territories administered by the U.S. My time is up right now. I've got a couple more points that I'll make in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farrell. And after listening to all these official presentations about the different formulas of status and the institutional position as well, it would be good to sort of loosen up a little bit and be able to exchange a few impressions. And as mentioned earlier, we also have a panelist. It was difficult to really put together a panel of professionals who would be asking questions. But I am glad that that at least given the time constraints and everything else, we were able to have Mr. Manasseh Mansour, who was a former staff director, actually, and senior advisor on insular and international affairs for the United States House of Representatives and current consultant on federal and international affairs. So at this point, I would like to offer the opportunity for Mr. Mansour to present a question to our guest speakers, and would appreciate if you could use a minute and a half for your response.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me just make a really important acknowledgement. In end of December, I was released from an 18-month active duty deployment over in the Iraq combat zone, and I just want to really acknowledge all of my combat buddies from Puerto Rico that I served with there, all their sacrifices, you know, it really doesn't matter what their party affiliation is or their ultimate political status preference. The fact of their service, I was proud to serve with them, and I just want to make that acknowledgement. For Manuel Rodriguez Orellana, could you please explain how an independent Puerto Rico would expand, or sustain and expand economic development and job creation?
Do I have 6 months for that? Well, let me just say, as I mentioned in the course of my remarks, there are nations that are smaller than Puerto Rico, or equally small, or equally overpopulated, that have done very well. So I take it that your question is not because of the size of Puerto Rico. So it would have to be because of the people. And I don't understand why we would be any different from anybody else who has made it in the world. The fact is that size of nations has become important in an inverse proportion at this point. If you, just recently, I think last year, a couple of scholars from MIT and Brown University published a book called The Size of Nations, in which they point out that a country integrated into a world economy has the world as its market. So as in a time of free flow of goods in a world economy, for a country like Puerto Rico to have the world as its market is not a bad deal. In fact, the fact that Puerto Rico had access to the U.S. market when nobody else did was a bonus for Puerto Rican productivity. But now, Puerto Rico is not privileged in that sense. Many other countries have free market access to the United States. There's the efforts to expand the free trade agreements between the United States and other Latin American countries, the ones that already exist between the United States, or among the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So I think that what we're dealing with here is integrating into the rest of the world. Right now, we are isolated from the rest of the world, and so we cannot market the goods that we could produce or the services that we could produce. And finally, let me just say that these authors, Alsina and Spaloare, the authors of this book called The Size of Nations, point out that of the 10 richest nations in the world, 6 of them have populations of less than 1 million. So in fact, the size here does not matter. In fact, it can help. Very good, thank you. Oh, and of course, you know, I'm talking about a transitional period from being a dependent economy to a healthy interdependence in the world economy. And I am talking about maintaining the best possible relations with everyone in the world, including the United States.
Thank you. For the former Secretary of Education, Carlos Chardon, Mr. Farrell mentioned that the House had passed a bill in 1998, and one of the provisions in the bill stated that under statehood, it was the policy of the U.S. Congress that every child in Puerto Rico in public school by age 10 would be proficient in English. So my question to you is, how do you see that that could best be implemented? And does it need to wait until statehood, given there are so many countries around the world, whether it's China or many other places, are putting a huge emphasis on English speaking for their citizens?
Tragically, that cannot be implemented with the current leadership of all parties. They're more interested in status than they're interested in the welfare of the children. That's number one. Number two, the current situation of the Department of Education is such that English is not the only issue. By age 10, kids can't read or write Spanish. Kids can't add or subtract in math. Kids have very little knowledge. And part of that is very much the result of a highly politicized system that prizes teachers going into politics to do politics, taking a half a year out, and then they come back to teach. What we have in the Department of Education, which, by the way, employs 1 out of every 4 persons employed in Puerto Rico, is possibly the biggest political training program that we have anywhere in the world. It cannot happen now. That is why I suggest we have to go back to self-respect. We have to go back to self-esteem. We have to go back to being plain honest, and a word which I'm glad that that Luis brought it up, a word that has disappeared from our vocabulary in Puerto Rico, a word that's called dignity. And I'll just close with Hostos. Eugenio María de Hostos, our greatest philosopher, once said, we all know what has to be done. We just don't have the will.
Thank you. Question for Jeffrey Farrow. We are emphasizing here full democracy, but structurally, what would need to be done to extend and implement full federal voting process in Puerto Rico? How structurally difficult would that be?
It would be very simple. States conduct their own elections. Puerto Rico would be entitled to 2 senators, 6 representatives, and 8 electoral votes. The Elections Commission of Puerto Rico would put those candidacies on the ballot as they put candidacies for local offices on the ballot right now, and the candidacy for resident commissioner, the representative to the United States. That's all that really is required.
Thank you. And for a quick question for Mr. Luis Vega Ramos. Which international organizations do you feel should be involved and could be most instructive in resolving Puerto Rico's political status?
In resolving, well, the several bills that I've seen and that have been dealt by Congress since 1981, since the Bennett Johnston McClure bills, stated that the United States has a self-determination responsibility, and self-determination is part of the U.S. constitutional system through various decisions of the courts, mainly as a principle of international law. So that would mean that at least, and some congressional bills have stated that clearly, others not necessarily as clearly, that at least general principles of self-determination of nations as established by the UN General Assembly, namely resolutions 1514 of 1960, 1541 of 1960, and some others, particularly dealing with Puerto Rico, should be taken into account. And the options that those resolutions present are totally compatible with what the 3 political parties leaders are saying that they want as options for the future plebiscite or for the future process, which are non-colonial and non-territorial. I think that is why the separate consensus, because of one of them, and sadly it is current Senator Rosselló, the state leader, it has been impossible for the 3 political leaders to sit down at the same table at the same moment without any intermediary to say this at the same, in one clear voice, at least separately. I have heard Governor Aníbal Acevedo Vilá say recently, and I have heard Independence Party President Rubén Berrío Martinez say recently, and I have heard Senator Rosselló say recently that they want the options to be non-colonial and non-territorial. And that complies, I think, clearly with US law, with international law, and with the dignity-oriented aspirations of the people of Puerto Rico. And it'd be a really sad day that because of current partisan bickering and finger-pointing in Puerto Rico, which is what we're having now, this process can't move forward. So my proposal is to get to the point of what you're saying is, why can't Pedro Rosselló, Governor Aníbal Acevedo Vilá, and Rubén Berríos Martínez sit on a table together with a pitcher of water and discuss this for a couple of hours, and at the end of those couple of hours, see if we can have a Puerto Rican plan that we can send to Washington instead of 3 conflicting partisan initiatives.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mansour, and thank you to the panelists as well. And now, I'm sure you had a chance to write some questions as well, and it's important because there are no microphones on that end as well. We want to make sure this is picked up by the audio box as well for the live broadcast. Okay, I have a question here. Is it which side is this? This one? Okay, I imagine. Sprawl is eating up. Oh, okay. Sprawl is eating up pristine land. Water is scarce. Solid waste production is among the highest in the world, and enforcement of environmental laws is lacking. Does status have an impact on or drive Puerto Rico's environmental degradation? To any of the speakers who want to comment.
Those of you that know me know the answer. Yes, it does have. Most of environmental waste is created in the legislature. But it does have an impact. And it does have an impact because we're not paying attention to the fundamental problems. That's what I said, the problem with education. We're much too preoccupied with status. It does have an impact, and we are allowing very many of these problems to be developed. It's got another element which is very important. And this is fundamental to understand what's happening in Puerto Rico. The environmental issue in the States and in Puerto Rico is one of those small spaces where there's some latitude for protest. There's some latitude because government cannot deal with it. So people can't get into it. So it's the small spaces, small problems, and I think that this is very good. What's happening in Puerto Rico in terms of environmental activism is excellent. And it may be tied a little bit to politics too, but it's very important because government is much too busy doing their own thing, which is protecting their jobs.
Thank you. We have a question here from Mr. Rodriguez Orellana. You want to comment? Okay.
I'll make my comment in answering the next question.
Sure.
Sure.
But I do want to make a comment on
Okay,
the environment
go
thing.
ahead.
I'm sorry that the consequence is that Manuel got skipped, but he'll. Very briefly. First of all, I think there has been some benefit, a lot of benefit of the application of federal legislation and rules in the protection of the environment in Puerto Rico, and that's something that has helped. But I want to stress 2 points now. Before that came along, the Constitution of Puerto Rico, adopted in 1952, the same year and in the same process that the present relationship has been established and the proclamation of Commonwealth went into existence. That Constitution specifically states, unlike the Constitution, say, of the United States, that it is a constitutional political policy of the government and the state and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico to protect its natural resources, and that's clearly stated in the Constitution, and it's in the Constitution of the Commonwealth, and it's a protection that is very cherished, and that many groups, activist groups, as Carlos was saying, have been fighting. There's been problems, there have been setbacks, there have been problems where corruption and other interests and the interest of economic development have created problems in implementing that protection, but it is there, and some strides are being made forward. I have to agree with something that Carlos said, that there's a lot of environmental problems coming up from the legislature. And one of them, and the current legislature, I have to say, and one of them is the following, that has to do directly with this question. Last year, the legislative bodies of Puerto Rico and the governor approved a new penal code that clearly, for the first time in Puerto Rican history, created environmental crimes. And it set a series of environmental crimes that are among the most important ever written down in Puerto Rico. The current legislature is in an attempt to block the going into effect of that penal code. One of the biggest reasons that they're trying to block the implementation of that code is because of pressure of sectors that want to do away with the environmental crimes provision of that penal code. So one of the problems that we're having is that the same people that are doing away with those environmental crimes that are so important and so attuned with our constitutions are the same people who are not able to go from the Capitol to the Fortaleza, which is a 10-minute drive, and try to sit down with the president of the Independence Party and the president of the Popular Party to see if we can come with one voice to Washington.
Thank you. This question, again, for Mr. Rodrigo Orellana. With 25% of the Puerto Rico economy based on U.S. pharmaceuticals and close to 70% of the economy based on U.S. federal funding, how will the island economy survive and prosper under the independence option?
Okay. Before I go into that, that gives me a chance to expand on the question that Manasseh asked before about the economy. But before I go into that, I'm glad to see that my good friend Luis Vega Ramos has not yielded to the temptation to deal in partisan politics in Puerto Rico. And I'm sure that you are all illuminated by the discussion about what happened with the penal code and so on and so forth. And of course, if it is in the Commonwealth Constitution that the environment must be protected, then I am sure it is as protected as the right to privacy is, which the United States can violate anytime. Because the prohibition of death penalty, which the United States is implementing in Puerto Rico at this time, not the prohibition, but the death penalty. Now, the other thing is, I mean, you're always going to have an environmental problem and environmental concerns regardless of status. One of our worst offenders, I agree that the legislature has done its generous share of pollution, but I think that by and large the worst offender is the U.S. Navy and the conditions that it has left the island of Vieques in, and the lack of political will, Ostosiano will, if you wish, that we have seen from all those that have taken their turns at governing Puerto Rico in doing anything about it. So I think that it is a problem, yes, under any status, and it is a problem right now, and it is like human rights. Colonialism is a violation of human rights, and yet the United States is perfectly happy to indulge in it. So, in other words, I think that we have problems all over the place, and we need to tackle them. And the one that we're hoping to deal with soon, because it's been postponed inordinately, is that of status, and colonial status at best. About the economy, and of course, you know, there is a book that was published in the last couple of years by the former chairman of the Puerto Rico Economists Association, Edwin Irizarry Mora, a professor of economics at the University of Puerto Rico, and I am proud to say a member of my party and the candidate for resident commissioner in the last election. That book is unfortunately in Spanish, but I am sure that the GAO can get a hold of some of the federal translators, and the federal government has some of the best translators, and they're, instead of using them for transcribing and translating the eavesdropping that they do in violation of Puerto Rico's constitution, they could be better employed in translating something like this book. And it gives you a whole picture of how we need to move Puerto Rico's economy from one of dependence, which is what the question describes, to one of productivity. It has been done elsewhere. It has been done in countries, I repeat, smaller than Puerto Rico, more populated than Puerto Rico, with no natural resources, with no federal funds, with no food stamps, with no U.S. citizenship. And if that has been done elsewhere, and I think we have done a great deal in spite of not having the powers of sovereignty, I'm certain we can do more if we had the whole panel of instruments that we need, that are needed in today's world to insert Puerto Rico in the world economy. If after a reasonable transition period, say 8 to 10 years, using the powers of sovereignty, with a world economy out there, with a world market out there for Puerto Rico to insert itself in, we cannot go from an economy of dependence to one of productivity. Then we deserve statehood.
Question for Mr. Sorry.
La economía de Puerto Rico.
Question for Mr. Odysseylitsi. How do we convince the American people most effectively to accept and support petition for statehood?
That's an interesting point because, you know, the perception of what Puerto Rico is to, I'd say, mainland America, I think is totally different than what Puerto Rico really is, because most mainland America really sees Puerto Rico as the Puerto Ricans in Chicago, Puerto Ricans in New York, and that's all they really know. Most of them don't understand the fact that Puerto Rico has a highly educated workforce. Out of the 50 states, for example, highly educated, highly technical workforce. Out of the 50 states, if Puerto Rico were to compare itself to the level of education, Puerto Rico has the highest per capita enrollment in universities. And that goes back perhaps to the argument that my friend Manuel should have addressed, and that is the fact that Puerto Rico is a highly educated workforce. It has highly educated populace. And that's one of our problems. Carlos mentioned that we have 35,000 Puerto Ricans moving to the States, and they're moving to Florida, and they're moving to Orlando. And here's an interesting statistic. Out of the 350,000 people, Puerto Ricans that live in Orlando, the level of education is approximately 3 years higher than the general population of Orlando, and their Puerto Ricans' incomes are approximately 40% higher than the general population of Orlando. So, I'm sorry, I hate to make Manuel's argument because he didn't like my lack of nationalism, which I'm going to talk about that later if I have a chance. But the point is that, you see, because of the highly educated environment in Puerto Rico would be number one, a great contribution to the rest of the states as a state, but it could also survive very well as an independent republic, because Puerto Rico is surrounded by low-cost employment, by islands that have low-cost employment. You have a similar condition to Singapore and other places. But anyway, to convince the rest of the United States as to why Puerto Rico could be a valuable contribution, all you have to do is just tell the United States as to, number one, to keep Puerto Rico in the condition that it's in, it's absolutely costing you much too much money, and to accept Puerto Rico as a state, you will receive a very high benefit. And that's what my book is all about. I didn't mean to put in the pitch, but that's what it is.
Thank you. I mean, we have so many questions here that we would be probably all afternoon, all evening talking about this, but I sort of have an idea. I will submit these questions as well, and if you're interested to respond to some of these questions, we can post them online on the website as well for people to be able to continue this discussion throughout the upcoming days. But I do want to give you an opportunity to say some closing remarks in order to, in essence, round up your philosophy and your perspectives on what you were representing this afternoon. And I would like to start with Mr. Jeffrey Farrell. You may, we can do it informally, so you may stay, you may remain from your seat.
I will remain here. An institutional position and then a personal one, and two brief comments. The institutional position is the following. In official Washington, to many people, the issue appears to be one more of local partisan politics than a serious issue. Can educated Puerto Rican leaders really believe that the federal government will empower the Commonwealth to determine the application of federal laws? Washington is full of politicians who know promises made simply to win elections when they see them. Puerto Rican divisions' efforts to sabotage sincere federal efforts to respond to requests from Puerto Rico for action on the issue, particularly by Commonwealthers who fear that confirming that statehood is an option will result in a statehood majority in Puerto Rico, and pie-in-the-sky Commonwealth proposals are often why federal officials say to Puerto Ricans, it's up to you to decide and come back to us when you have a consensus on at least how to proceed. My personal statement. I take no sides among the options. It's a position I shared with President Clinton. We didn't believe that we should, but we strongly believe that the United States, which acquired Puerto Rico in war, has an obligation to enable Puerto Ricans to have a status that provides a democratic form of government at the national level, one that Puerto Ricans want from among all the real options. And I've worked hard for that. And then two final very brief comments. In response to a question about how to get Americans to support statehood for Puerto Rico, get Puerto Ricans to support statehood for Puerto Rico. If there's a majority in Puerto Rico for statehood, the United States will grant it. Second, with respect to Manuel's comment about the Navy's pollution in Vieques, which is absolutely accurate, I should note that the Navy is spending over $100 million to clean it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farrow. Mr. Chardon.
You know, 1 out of every 4 Hispanic engineers that graduates in the nation graduates in Puerto Rico. 1 out of every 4 MDs, Hispanic MDs, and pharmacists graduate in Puerto Rico. We have thousands of young men and women studying in the universities in the States who are residents of the island of Puerto Rico. Every 2 years, at least 2 dozen young men and women leave the University of Puerto Rico graduating to come to work to NASA. We have at least 1 Puerto Rican MD in every single heart operation team in Houston. And we have hundreds and hundreds of Puerto Rican MDs graduated from the University of Puerto Rico and the other 3 universities graduating. Individually, we're on the go. Collectively, we're set back by Congress. Now, for Puerto Ricans, there's much more compelling reason for statehood. We can rebuild, and we can rebuild on our young persons, those young men and women. We can rebuild what we've lost in the past 50 years under congressional tutelage. We can rebuild the culture of mutual respect, respect insofar as we are concerned amongst ourselves and respects with our fellow citizens and respects with the fellow citizens of the world. We have to rededicate ourselves to that which Michael Novak calls caritapolis, the culture of mutual respect. We must reject the culture of dependence. It's destructive of any human being. And we must build one of self-reliance and work. We need it for Commonwealth, we need it for statehood, and we need it for independence. We need it as a people, and we can do it if only Congress will get off our backs and let us go our way And that is why I suggest we can reclaim our dignity and self-respect, contributing to the nation. Anything but equality and enfranchisement for Puerto Rico is despicable, politically absurd, and inherently dangerous to the nation. I'll just finish a quote with something that we should have taken years ago into consideration. That great first American, Benjamin Franklin, he said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And we ain't got either one right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chardon. Mr. Manuel Rodriguez Orellana.
I want to thank Alex for adding part of my answer, but I've always thought that, and I've always sustained, that Alex, a person who does not believe in nationalism, is a lightly rooted Puerto Rican nationalist. I think also that all of the questions usually come in terms of how Puerto Rico can survive economically as an independent sovereign nation, but nobody has really sat down to answer me the question of how are we going to survive as a state? How are we going to move the economy out of dependence and into productivity? That's good because it has forced us, independentistas, to focus on that issue and write volumes about it. And in fact, in the process from 1989 to 1991, we went into great detail with the Congressional Budget Office, the General Accounting Office. Our economists met with them, and we had a blueprint of the transition period from dependence to sovereignty. In terms of the economy. And both Manasseh and Jeff know that that is true, and it's there. So the economic argument is a red herring. In fact, I think that the important thing at this point is not to continue to blame the victim. The victims of colonialism are Puerto Ricans. And Puerto Rico is the colony. Let's stop blaming Puerto Rico for being a colony. It is the United States that exercises the power. It is the United States that has the responsibility. There's absolutely nothing that Puerto Rico has not attempted in the past to try to get the United States to address this issue. I think we have finally begun. And I must go back to something I stressed in my earlier initial remarks. There is a political fact in Puerto Rico that all of Puerto Rico's elected representatives in the legislature unanimously voted to demand that the United States decolonize. Now the ball is in your court. Now you have to deal with that. We didn't ask you to come in. Please make sure that you turn the lights on the way out.
Thank you, Mr. Orellana. Mr. Vega Ramos.
Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. With all humility, I say again that I am the youngest person on this table, and that for many years I've had the opportunity to interact in this issue with many of my friends that are here. And I say this because maybe even though I'm the youngest here, I'm really the one that's left with the less amount of patience. I think it's time to act. I think we've wasted enough time, and I suspect that I may have less patience than some of my colleagues here. And what really kills me is that we have, as I've said a couple of times before, the three voices of our political spectrum saying through separate channels for the first time for as long as I can remember, and maybe some other people in this table can show me a time where this has happened before, that they want non-colonial, non-territorial options. That in itself is a great thing, but the divisiveness of some of the issues down in Puerto Rico and the lack of responsibility in the United States is making us miss another important opportunity. If I have to choose between the perspective of my good friend Jeff Farrow, that it is Commonwealth politics that have somehow derailed this discussion, or that it has been, or Manuel's perspective, I have to go closer to Manuel's. I mean, the problem has been lack of congressional will to enact a process to deal with Puerto Rico. The House has done it on a couple of times in 1990, and then again in 98, I'm sorry. But we've had the Senate, and if you ask me what's the first place that stakeholders need to look to try to get the option pushed forward, aside from the Puerto Rican electorate, which has never given them a majority, is the U.S. Senate. Each time the U.S. Senate has to deal with something that says statehood, the process dies. There are no 51 senators who are willing to discuss seriously a process of self-determination of Puerto Rico that includes that includes the option of statehood. And as long as the people of Puerto Rico haven't voted for statehood, and as long as you can get 51 warm bodies in the Senate, then we have a major problem. And instead of telling us, no, look, the people of the United States Senate are not willing to offer statehood of Puerto Rico for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, for racist reasons, for logical reasons, for illogical reasons, then they're not owning up to the responsibilities that they have. And that's something that cannot be pushed on the side of Puerto Rico and as a responsibility of Puerto Rico, even though we recognize that there have been people in the Senate, in the House, in the executive branches, in the branch in the last several years who have actually tried to move this issue forward. But the fundamental flaw has been that Congress has not yet assumed its responsibility. And finally, I have to make two more quick points. The issue of Puerto Rican nationality is not an issue of Madison Avenue and of baile, botella, and baraja. It is a question that is essential, that is at the very heart of this matter, because Puerto Ricans start from that point of being Puerto Rican, and as it pertains to the option of a developed, enhanced, empowered Commonwealth or Estado Libre Asociado or Free Associated State, which should be the correct English name for it, it's on a 3 criteria basis. Puerto Rican nationhood, as Mr. Farrow correctly stated, close national relationship with the United States, and that it's clearly of a non-territorial nature. The governor of Puerto Rico has said that he was a non-territorial relationship with the United States. Let's move forward. Let's have the U.S. face up to its 107-year responsibility, which it has not done so in an effective manner. And let's leave petty partisan politics in Puerto Rico. I'm not going to say who's to blame. But as once again I say it, there is no reason why the governor of Puerto Rico, Senator Pedro Rosselló, and former Senator Rubén Berríos Martínez cannot go to any table in Puerto Rico, talk about this for a couple of hours, and see if we can come with one voice to Washington instead of with 3 separate partisan plans. If we do that, we'll be a lot more effective in trying to move Congress in this issue instead of trying to block each other's initiatives.
Thank you, Mr. Vega Ramos. Any last words, Mr. Assimilate?
Yes, since my friend Manuel has been picking on me all afternoon, this is my chance to get even. You see, he's absolutely right. I hate nationalism. You see, English was my 3rd language. The only reason I know how to say this and that and not this and that is I used to practice in front of a mirror learning how to speak like a gringo, okay? You see, my origins are from the Caucasus, and that's Georgia and Chechnya, you know, that area around there. I grew up in the Balkans. That's Serbia and Bosnia and so on. And I grew up under the communist system. So, in other words, all my life, in the early part of my life, I've been either dodging bullets or marching in May 1st parades. So I think you can understand my aversion to nationalism because, I know what kind of harm that nationalism can do. Millions of people have died over that. So, Manuel, I hope you forgive me, but I don't like nationalism, all right? Now, the issue of Puerto Rico, and this is an interesting point. You see, and I have this in the afterword in my book. U.S. Congress, first of all, the way the founding fathers, American founding fathers, set up U.S. Congress is very simple, and that is that elected officials really can exercise very little integrity. It's almost impossible for them to exercise integrity. And thank God for that, because that means it's very difficult for a country like America to have another Hitler or a Stalin. And the reason for that is this. You see, U.S. Congress responds to capital, which provides the money for them to get reelected, okay? And it also responds to their constituents, which is the people that vote for them. So therefore, if capital comes to Congress and gives them money, and as long as the money that they give them, the people don't object to, they continue to do what capital tells them. And maybe that's good because capital provides jobs, moves the economy, and so on. Now, the reason that Puerto Rico has been a colony, not for 107 years, but 500 years, because it's been a colony of Spain, but especially for the 107 years that it's been a colony of the U.S., is simply because, you see, in the first 50 years, Puerto Rico's economy was controlled by agricultural interests, mainly sugar and so on, okay? So Congress responded to capital, okay? The sugar interests, all right? But there were no voters in America that cared about what would happen to Puerto Rico. The next 50 years, Congress was responding to the industrial interests in Puerto Rico. Lately, the pharmaceuticals. Once again, members of Congress were taking in the money so they could get reelected, but there was nobody in their neighborhoods and their constituents that was ever coming back to them and say, listen, if you keep Puerto Rico as a colony, I'm not going to vote for you anymore. Well, you know, I'll tell you what's happening. I go on national radio at least 2, 3, 4 times a week, and many members of Congress have become friends of mine, and they're suddenly starting to call me and tell me, listen, my constituents are calling me and they're telling me, listen, what are we going to resolve this Puerto Rican issue? Well, here is the point, because it's either costing me too much money, or either let's get rid of them, or let's make them a state and let's make them pay taxes. Well, that's really the point. The day that Puerto Rico will ever move from this colonial status to some kind of a permanent status will be when the American people get so mad at their members of Congress that they'll say, if you continue to take money from capital, we're not going to vote you into office because Puerto Rico is either costing us too much money, let's make them pay taxes, or Puerto Rico is just costing us too much money and we got to let them go. One of those two issues are the key issues, and it's the voters in their districts that are going to make that difference, not the 3 members of the party of Puerto Rico, not Puerto Rico's legislators, not Puerto Rico's leaders. It's going to be the voters in the 50 states of America that's going to make the difference. And that's the real point of my book.
Thank you, Mr. Ducholitze. And I think we have to agree this has been an extraordinary afternoon. And we're pressed with time, but I would like you to join me in recognizing our distinguished guests this afternoon and our panelists as well, Mr. Manasseh Mansour. I would like to also extend a special thanks to the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, Dr. William Leogrand, the Assistant Dean, Laura Murray, Associate Director of American University's Media Relations Office, Marilee Seller, Dr. David Rosenblum, the Special Events Office, Public Safety, Audiovisual Department, and other institutional divisions, and the volunteers who have provided great assistance before the event and throughout today's developments. Thank you to all of you. The transcript of this event will shortly be available, as well as the entire video recording of this forum. So we look forward to your interest in following up, and we'll add the questions as well that I know you want. And if there are any left out questions, make sure you write them down, and I will be collecting them as well to make sure we incorporate them into the website as well. We appreciate their interest in taking this event to the international scene via the internet. The Puerto Rico Herald, who's offered the opportunity to present this transcript in the next couple of days. And I feel great satisfaction about the outcome of this initiative, and on behalf of the School of Public Affairs, I appreciate your interest and serious commitment to this matter of great interest to all Puerto Ricans who are truly in search of full democracy. For the first time, there is a consensus among the different ideological sectors in Puerto Rico that the current status must be changed. The political parties and civic leaders have embraced this notion. Both national parties have it in their platforms, and the President of the United States has a task force for it. I would like to end this historic discussion with a quote from a very inspiring man, Martin Luther King Jr., which highlights the essence of what we have lived today. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Thank you, and may God bless Puerto Rico.
Muchas gracias.
Well, good. Finally meet you.
Yeah, good.
Está la cosa.
I'm glad you.